Welcome back to the Wise Up podcast, your weekly dose of business wisdom delivered to you by the members of Open Water. I am your host, Chris Albrecht, and today we're going to be talking about leadership. So I'm thrilled to have as my guest Minette Norman. She's a former tech executive who is now a speaker, author, and leadership consultant. She's written the book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, and she is our guest today. Welcome to the show, Minette.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about leadership and inclusivity, but let's sort of set some boundaries here, some parameters for our talk. Tell me about the difference between diversity and inclusion and why that distinction is so important.
Yeah, it's a very important distinction because I think people think of them glommed together as sort of the same thing, and not at all. I mean, diversity is very simply the differences in human beings, in this case, when we're talking about the workplace. And that can be anything as clear as gender or ethnicity, race. And then it can be hidden differences like what is your socioeconomic status? What is your religion? What is your, neurodiversity, the ways our brains are wired. So there's all these aspects of diversity. It's like all the ways we are different. That's diversity. But inclusion is what is your experience in a setting when it is a diverse group of people? And all too often, especially in recent years, the focus has been on let's hire a more diverse workforce. So let's get more women, let's get more people of color. But unless you focus on inclusion, which is really the experience of people feeling that they are welcome, they are fully accepted, they are heard, they are valued for their unique self, what you get is you get homogeneity even within diverse workforces. So you can hire a diverse workforce, but if you expect that everyone think the same way, behave the same way, speak the same way, then you're basically masking all the differences and you're getting this conformity. So we have to really make people feel that they are welcome and respected for who they are uniquely, so they feel that sense of inclusion and belonging. So I think that's the distinction I would make, is that they don't automatically go together. When you bring in a diverse group, you don't automatically get inclusion. And that's why I focus so much on inclusive leadership, of how do we create the conditions where a diverse group of people can collaborate, have their voices and ideas heard, and where we can tap into the power of diversity, which has been proven to result in better business results, better performance, and better innovation. Because when we have minds who don't think alike, we get to innovation. But we don't get into that unless we can really create that inclusive, and I will add, psychologically safe environment.
Okay, so if you're a leader at a company, what's the best first step to begin building this culture of inclusivity?
Such a simple question, right? And it's like there's not a one word answer or a one sentence answer, but this is what I would say, and this is what I say in my work with leaders, is that the first thing we have to do is we have to start with ourselves and our own behavior as leaders, because whether we acknowledge it or not, we are setting the tone for our organizations, and people are watching us. They are noticing what we communicate and what we stay silent about. They're noticing what we reward and what we ignore or even punish. And so we have to get very much aware of, like, how are we showing up? How are we engaging with people? How are we listening? This is something I talk about a lot, is like, how do we listen to one another? Because if we're unconscious, what was really common is that we listen attentively to the people that are most like us, the people who agree with us, the people who nod their heads every time we open our mouths. And we're more inclined to ignore or even sort of dismiss the people who may think differently, who may challenge us, who may not see eye to eye with us. So we have to tune into, how are we listening? And then how are we responding? If someone says, Minette, I disagree with you, I'm seeing things from a different angle. Do I, as a leader, respond to that with an open mind and say, tell me more, I want to hear about it, I'm truly curious? Or do I get defensive and say, like, I've really thought out my ideas, and I'm not open to another perspective, or you're wrong, or something that shames the other person? Then we basically are shutting down this inclusive environment, because we're signaling that we're not open to a different perspective or a different way of seeing things. So that's the first step, is really this listening, managing our reactions when we get defensive, when we are challenged. And then, then it goes beyond our own behavior to, what are the group norms that I help establish as a leader here? how do we interact in meetings, in group settings? How do we make sure that every person does get to speak, that they do get to contribute? And that doesn't happen automatically. So that's why there's a lot of, I think, about self-awareness and deliberate practices to make sure that everyone can fully contribute. That's what an inclusive environment is. And that's where leaders play such an outsized role. And I will add that, of course, everyone that you work with influences your experience in the workplace, but leaders are just being observed so much. And they're really, they're basically saying what is allowed, what's tolerated, how do we behave?
I want to follow up on something that you said just a minute ago, right? And I want to approach this by saying that I agree with you, right? Like the diversity of opinions and thoughts is really important to sort of building a strong organization. And then, so if you think of it as like the first part is casting a wide net. How do we find people who are different from the people that are already here, right? And then the second part is sort of bringing them all together. How do you bring them into one organization? But I'm wondering, as you said, like you can find diversity on sort of an outward level. So you could find people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different races, right? That's sort of easy to at least identify, right? And then you could go one step further and probably say things like, the gender identification or things that somebody might be a little more reserved. But I'm wondering what's interesting to me is the idea of that versus making sure you don't have people thinking all of the same way, right? And do you have ways that people can sort of, I guess what I'm getting at is getting a little bit deeper in terms of like, what are you going to challenge me on this? Do you present a different point of view other than sort of the orthodoxy of an organization? Does that make sense?
Well, let me make sure I understand your question. Are you talking about how do we identify different thinkers when we're hiring them, or how do we invite them into the conversation when we already have them there?
Probably both, right?
Both.
Like, because
Okay.
it would be like if you are a leader looking to build your team,
Mm-hmm.
and you can, like I said, there's like a surface level, for lack of, I don't mean that as a pejorative, right? Like, but there are some ways you could identify people who are different from you from different backgrounds. But what I think is really interesting is sort of this idea that you said around like just the thought processes, making sure that people feel safe to challenge you. And how do you find those sort of different ideas of thought, right? That
Mm-hmm.
might be a little bit harder to sort of uncover as you are looking to build sort of a a what's the word I'm looking for? Like a diverse, mindset
Yeah,
culture.
yeah, and then that's often referred to as cognitive diversity, right? Like it's different
Sure.
ways of thinking, right? So I think let's take the two parts. I want to find people who don't think like everyone else in the team as I'm hiring. So I think the way we have to do that is we have to get really clever. I mean, I'm not saying clever. We need to get perhaps creative in how we ask questions and how we conduct our interviews. And I think that one of the things that we got trained in when I was in tech is doing behavioral interviewing, where you ask people to tell stories about a real thing that has happened to them in their lives and how they dealt with it. And sometimes through those kinds of interview questions, like tell me about a time when you dealt with conflict, or where a project failed and how did you recover from it, whatever. When you hear people start to tell stories, you do get some insight into how they think and how they even talk about their history. That will give you a little bit of insight, but you may need to actually probe for, like, maybe you set up a scenario where you want someone to poke holes in something that you've developed. That could be part of an interview. It's like, we've got this product strategy or whatever it is you're interviewing for, and we think this is going to work. How might you come at it from a different angle? And just to get insight into how people's minds work. I think what you'll see, I mean, sometimes a big difference is not even that someone thinks in a revolutionary way compared to everybody else, but maybe you have a team of all extroverts, and you realize that everyone's always talking over everyone, and they're always like quick on their feet to think, and what you need is someone who's a deeply introverted deep thinker to balance something out, or you need some more of that. So that you can pretty easily assess generally in interviews and things like that. So let's just assume that you've been able to hire people who don't all think alike. I think that may be easier than the part of, like, how do you get them to really work well together and collaborate? Because often we're stepping on each other's toes, or this is what I saw a lot of when I was managing teams. is it's true that in a group where you have maybe a few dominant personalities or extroverted personalities, they will do most of the talking when you're having, for example, a staff meeting or a team meeting. And those people who have really creative, maybe the most innovative breakthrough ideas are often the quieter people in the room, the people who need more time to process on their own. And these are the people that we need to make sure we tap into their ideas and their talents. And so that's more about like, how do we run our meetings, for example? How do we generate ideas and make sure everyone's ideas are first considered before we move forward with strategies and decisions? And that's why I think they're great techniques we can use. It's not, I don't think this is rocket science. I've seen this work so well in diverse teams where, you don't do it by necessarily everyone speaking in a meeting. Instead, maybe what we do is we use, if we're in a physical room, we use a whiteboard. And if we're in a virtual meeting, we use Miro or Mural or Jamboard. And we get everyone to silently reflect on some of the hard things we're dealing with. And they put down their ideas on sticky notes and they all put them up. And suddenly you see the ideas emerge that would never have emerged if someone had to speak in that meeting where all the loud people were dominating, right? So that's what I've seen, is that we need to be creative in how do we make sure we can hear all of the really interesting perspectives before we narrow down. So we go broad, we get to consider all the ideas, and then we say like, oh yeah, this one's really worth exploring, or these three are worth exploring. But now we've heard from everybody and we're tapping into the full potential of this more diverse group of people and thinkers.
I think that's a really good tactical bit of advice there, because it's easy to say, structurally, so many things are centered around a meeting. And to your point,
Yes.
the dynamic of a meeting may not always be an inclusive one for a lot of reasons, right? Also, depending on how big the meeting is. So I
Mm-hmm.
really think that the idea of post-it notes is a really good tool that people could use, just to help, make sure. And I'm sure that you learned that from your time as like a tech executive and leading
Exactly. We did
teams.
a lot of that. And that's where, I mean, that was honestly where I learned, because I'm a fairly extroverted person, and that was where I learned about, first of all, the power of silence. And I actually had someone on my team who was very, very introverted and very, very creative. And one day we were doing one of those exercises where everyone was writing down their ideas. And we were physically in a room together, and I could see him generating post-it after post-it. And I said to him later, I am just amazed at the amount of ideas that you can produce so quickly. And he said to me, that's not really my best work. He said, if you had given me this assignment in advance to think about, and I had had time alone in quiet, I would have had even better ideas. This was just like what came to me in the room. And it was like, oh, not everyone processes the same way. And I need to make sure I give space and time and silence for people who really do process differently and who may come up with that idea we all need.
Yeah. You touched on something earlier about sort of the idea of leaders being open and open to listening, right?
Hmm.
And one of the things that immediately came to mind is sort of me as a parent, just thinking like, oh, well, it's because I say so, right? Like, and obviously there's a different dynamic between like a 12-year-old and, a professional, but that is such it can be such a um, important way to bring people in when you aren't acting defensive. And so, do you have ways for leaders to sort of become aware of blind spots in either how they're leading or the program they're leading or the product or whatever without getting defensive?
Oh, I almost think we have to take apart that question into two parts. And the first part is like becoming aware of the blind spots. And then the second part is not getting defensive. And the reason I say that is like, first of all, they are blind spots because we don't know about them. So how do we uncover them? And I think one of them is that we do it as a leader, it's hard to get feedback sometimes, right? Because people people don't want to say like I'm the VP, and people don't want to say, Minette, that was a really confusing presentation. They just don't want to say that because of your positional authority. So I think understanding those blind spots, I think it's really important for leaders to have trusted advisors and trusted confidants. And I remember like this really helped me. Like I was a VP working with a bunch of other VPs and SVPs, and I had someone that I really trusted who was one of my peers, and I said, can you give me some feedback on how I'm coming across, how I'm communicating? And I did uncover some blind spots there. I was like, and she would say to me, like, you were really good and you were really clear here, and then you got defensive here, or you got a little accusing here, or whatever it was. And I was like, oh, I didn't see that. So I think the first answer is that we need to find people who are truth tellers, who care about us. Like, it's not that they're going to make you feel terrible, but to say like, hey, Chris, did you know that you do this? And maybe you're not aware of it, right? It could be a verbal tick, or it could be something with your body language, or all the things we don't notice about ourselves, right? So I think that's the first part. Managing the defensiveness is a really hard thing. And it's something that for me has been a decades-long practice, really. And the first part there is to become aware and notice that we're getting defensive. And this comes down to our brains and neuroscience, is that when we are getting attacked, whether it's a verbal attack, we're being criticized, or we're about to get attacked by a mountain lion in the woods, right? Our brains go into this fight, flight, freeze mood. That is our instinctive brain response to danger. Our brains don't distinguish between that physical danger and social or emotional danger, where we're getting criticized or embarrassed. And so what we have to become aware of is that when that happens, our amygdala is firing, and we don't have access to our higher reasoning, our rational brain. So I recognize it, like, immediately. Now I can recognize it. My face immediately feels beet red, and my heartbeat is racing. And like I read in this great book called Radical Collaboration, that I read years ago when I was still in tech, by James Tam. He says those physical signals, whether it's, clammy hands or a racing heartbeat, those are our early warning signals that we're getting defensive. And it's very powerful then. And I've done this with lots of groups, is like, tell me what those physical signs are. Everyone knows what they are. Like, we've all experienced it. We experience all the time. So what we can do then is become aware that I am getting defensive. And it's like, hold on, Minette, slow down. And that slowing down, what I just did was I just took a sigh, I just took a breath. And, one thing you can also do is take a sip of water before you do anything else. And what that does is it calms the amygdala response. It brings back your prefrontal cortex. You can start having dialogue again. And now you can respond in a way that's not going to be to lash out and fight at someone and say, like, how dare you say that to me, or whatever embarrassing thing it's going to be. And instead you can say, oh, thanks for that, Chris. I need to understand that. Can you say a bit more? Or you could even say, and I think this is kind of a vulnerable act that people appreciate, is like, that just hit me a little bit hard, and I don't want to respond in a way I'm going to regret. So let me just take a moment, right? Just acknowledge you're having this reaction. We're all human. We all get defensive. And then we can pick and choose how we want to respond, instead of having that automatic instinctive reaction, which could be fight, and it could be freeze. Like, I've talked to people who said, like, when I get defensive, I'm like in this tunnel where I can't see straight, I can't hear, I am literally frozen. And so the breathing, doing something physical with your body to change your state, can get you out of that defensiveness. So to come back to your question, I think becoming self-aware of those blind spots is going to take someone to help you, because we don't know what they are. And then I think we have to manage when someone calls us out on something, or, someone may get defensive and lash out at us. We don't need to lash back out at them. We can have a more measured response.
I want to talk about a topic that's come up here often on the podcast, actually, which is the idea of psychological safety and how critical it is to the success of teams.
Mm.
And what I'm curious about here is there can you create just as you are looking to create different viewpoints and bring in sort of diverse backgrounds and people and extroverts and introverts, can you create sort of a level of, like, a baseline of psychological safety for an organization? Or does it constantly need to be sort of adjusted, basically, per person, right? So I guess what I'm wondering is that there seems to be a push and pull, right, in creating a safe environment for people to express themselves and challenge ideas and things like that. But then it also seems like, as you create more and more viewpoints, that might become more complicated, because you have to adjust sort of the level of psychological safety per your meeting, or the person you're meeting with, or in how you communicate with things. Am I making sense there?
You are making sense. And I think I think the way to answer that is this, that psychological safety is experienced at a group level. It's like in this group, whether it's a staff or whether it's a cross-functional team that gets together regularly. In this group, I feel that I can be myself, I can ask a question, I can make a mistake, and I know there will not be shame or negative consequences, right? So when you said, can I establish psychological safety across an organization, I would say it really depends on the size of that organization. Like if you run a big company, it's going to be different in every single team, because it really is like those interactions with those people in that group of 10 or in that group of 12 or whatever it is. I think that leaders, for sure, like at the senior level, if you have an executive staff that truly demonstrates open-mindedness, that every time they hold an all-hands meeting, for example, and they get tough questions, they are really open to the challenge. They don't put anyone down. They answer what they can, and they admit when they don't have an answer. When you see that happening, you start to understand that maybe this whole organization really is a place where it's psychologically safe. But you won't believe it until you have those interactions in the group that you are a part of, or the groups that you are a part of, where you just are able to express yourself and you don't get ignored, shut down, embarrassed regularly. And so I think, and I do a lot of work on psychological safety with organizations because it's so foundational to getting to inclusion and then getting to high performance and innovation and employee well-being. So I think it's foundational to all these other things. And it comes through small, consistent behaviors. And it comes from things like listening without getting defensive. It comes from things like we can talk about failures openly, not shaming people, but instead, what do we learn from what went badly? And what can we do better as a group going forward? It comes from leaders who don't have to be perfect and who can admit, I learned something here and I'm going to do better. It comes from all of these small behaviors, and it comes from how do we run our meetings and how do we interact, and do we put each other down, or do we yes and them, like, I don't necessarily agree with you, Chris, and I'm not going to say but here, right? I'm going to say that's an interesting idea and I have another way of seeing it, right? So all of these little things, and that's why the work that I do, I like, there's so much out there about leadership and inclusion, diversity, psychological safety, and a lot of it is very lofty. And I want to take it down to what are the actions that I, as a leader at any level, can do every day? What are my behaviors? What are the small changes I can make that will make a big difference? And I think if we invest in those daily, what I've seen is that we can create and scale psychological safety, but it may be one leader and one team at a time.
What if I like to dig my heels in and never think that I'm wrong? I'm
Well,
just kidding.
there are many of those, right? And unfortunately, yeah, that's a whole other issue.
Okay, so that's actually leads me to my next question,
Okay.
which is, let's say that you were trying to create psychological safety, which we've established is really important to not just people's overall being, but to the success of a company. It's really important.
Yep.
And let's say you have two scenarios and you're trying to create psychological safety. One is, and this is sort of like as a leader, right? So
Okay.
one is if you're building something from the ground up, and so you have more control over it. And the second is if you're brought into an organization that's already entrenched in, let's just call it like a toxic
Yep.
sort of culture. What are the different ways that you can create psychological safety in those two different scenarios?
Well, I think I would say it's definitely easier when you're building something from the ground up, because you can establish these norms from day one. If you're bringing together a new team, you can say, look, I value hearing all the voices. I value that we do not all agree. And I commit to you as the leader of this group that I am going to continuously practice having an open mind, listening, making sure all of you can be heard. So, we just established those norms from day one. And of course, it's not like flipping a switch. You can't just say, I believe in psychological safety and therefore it is. We have to consistently behave in those ways. The tougher one and one that I've certainly experienced, is when you inherit or come into a toxic culture, a culture that, people are holding back, people are terrified because they've had traumatic experiences in the workplace, and many of us have. Unfortunately, too many of us have. So I think then, if you're a leader, you're trying to reset a new baseline of like, how do we behave? And I think what we have to do there is we have to acknowledge that it hasn't been great, and that people have had harmful experiences, diminishing and demeaning experiences maybe, and to say like, I am committed to change. And I know that it's going to take some time, because we will not, we can't flip a switch. I can't say I'm a new leader and therefore we negate everything that has already happened. We have to start in a way fresh, but knowing there's a lot of baggage there. And what I've found, and what I hear from a lot of people I've worked with, is that some people can come along, and some people can really like, okay, this is not the same as how it was, and this leader really means it, and I can now start to speak up. Maybe I can start to dissent. Maybe I can share these wild ideas that I would never have shared before. Unfortunately, there are some people who, maybe use the word traumatized. It's like they've been too traumatized, and they can't believe that anything could be different. And so they're bringing all the baggage and all of the harm that's been done to them, and they're just still in that mindset. So they continue not to participate. They continue not to share their ideas, and they withdraw. And those are tough cases. I don't think it's the norm, but you may, like, if you as a leader come into a situation like that, you maybe have 10 people on your team, and maybe 9 of them really you bring along into this new way of interacting, and there's just one person who can't move along. And those can be some hard decisions, like, are they going to be able to participate in this team? Is there anything you can do to get them to speak up or to share their ideas? That may take longer for some people, but mostly I think it's just this daily interactions, these daily positive experiences that can really shift a culture from very negative and toxic to positive and productive and inclusive.
All right. Well, this has been super fascinating and super helpful. Minette Norman, you are a speaker, author, leadership consultant, and author of The Boldly Inclusive Leader. If people wanted to find out more about you and your services and your book, where should they go?
Yeah, just go to my website, minettenorman.com, and I have free downloads and lots of information about what I do.
That's Minette Norman, 1N, 2Ts, .com. Minette, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today.
Thanks for the great questions, Chris. This was a great conversation.